I never thought a simple family dinner would change everything. But standing in Margaret Richardson's pristine kitchen, watching her scrape my homemade lasagna into the garbage disposal while calling it peasant food, I realized this wasn't just about dinner. This was about respect, boundaries, and the moment I decided I wouldn't be anyone's doormat anymore. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The whole thing started 3 months earlier when my husband David and I moved to Boston. He'd gotten a promotion at his consulting firm, and we were finally in a position to start fresh. David came from money, old Boston money, the kind where your great-grandfather's portrait hangs in the country club, and your mother still uses china that belonged to her grandmother. I came from Kansas, where my dad worked construction, and my mom cleaned houses to make ends meet. When David first brought me home to meet his parents 2 years ago, I knew I was walking into a different world. The Richardson family estate in Beacon Hill was the kind of place you see in movies. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and rooms that looked like they belonged in a museum. Margaret Richardson greeted me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and a handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds. But I was in love, and David assured me his mother would warm up to me eventually. He was wrong. Margaret had her own ideas about who her son should marry. She'd dropped hints about Sarah Whitman, a family friend who'd gone to Harvard and whose father owned half of downtown Boston. Sarah was everything I wasn't: polished, connected, and born into the same social circle that had shaped David's entire life. The first sign of trouble came during our engagement party. Margaret had insisted on hosting it at their country club, and I'd spent weeks agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on a navy dress that I thought struck the right balance between elegant and appropriate. The moment I walked in, Margaret's eyes swept over me with barely concealed disappointment. "Oh, Emma," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How interesting. I didn't realize we were going casual tonight." I looked around the room and realized that every other woman was wearing black or jewel tones, their dresses, clearly designer pieces that cost more than my monthly rent. I felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter, and Margaret knew it. Throughout the evening, she made subtle comments that cut like paper cuts. When someone asked about my job as a graphic designer, she'd interject with, "Emma does something with computers, don't you, dear?" When I mentioned my family, she'd nod politely before immediately changing the subject to David's accomplishments or their family's upcoming charity gala. David didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he chose not to see it. When I brought it up later, he'd brush off my concerns with, "That's just how Mother is. She's protective, but she means well." But I knew the difference between protective and cruel. Margaret Richardson was an expert at making people feel small while maintaining plausible deniability. She never said anything outright offensive. She was too sophisticated for that. Instead, she wielded exclusion and condescension like surgical instruments, precise and devastating. The wedding planning was a nightmare. Margaret had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the music, even my dress. She'd phrase her criticisms as helpful suggestions, but the message was clear. Nothing I chose was good enough for her son. When I selected a beautiful but affordable photographer, she sighed and said, "Well, I suppose not everyone can afford the best. We'll just have to make do." She took over the guest list, adding dozens of people I'd never met while quietly reducing the number of seats allocated for my family. When I protested, she explained that the venue had space constraints, and these were important business connections for David's career. My cousins from Kansas suddenly became expendable, while strangers in expensive suits became essential. The breaking point during wedding planning came when she hired a different caterer without consulting me. I'd spent weeks working with a local company run by a wonderful woman named Rosa Martinez, who specialized in fusion cuisine that honored both David's New England roots and my Midwestern background. The menu was perfect, elegant but warm, sophisticated but accessible. Margaret canceled the contract and hired Bradford and Associates, the same company that catered every society event in Boston. When I found out, I was devastated. Rosa had become more than a vendor. She was someone who understood my vision and respected what I was trying to create. "It's nothing personal, dear," Margaret explained when I confronted her. "It's just that Bradford has been handling our family events for decades. People expect a certain standard at Richardson family gatherings." That phrase, Richardson family gatherings, became her weapon of choice. Anytime I had an opinion or preference that differed from hers, she'd remind me that this was how things were done in the Richardson family. Not our family, not David's family, but the Richardson family, as if I were some outsider being temporarily granted access to their sacred traditions. David's response was always the same. "She's just trying to help. Wedding planning is stressful, and Mother has experience with these things." He couldn't see that his mother wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to erase me. The wedding day itself was beautiful, but it felt like I was a guest at someone else's event. Everything was perfect according to Margaret's standards, but none of it felt like mine. The flowers were white roses instead of the colorful wildflower arrangements I'd wanted. The music was a string quartet playing classical pieces instead of the acoustic guitarist who would have performed songs that actually meant something to David and me. Even my wedding dress felt wrong. Margaret had insisted on taking me shopping at the most exclusive bridal salon in Boston, where she'd steered me toward dresses that were undeniably gorgeous, but completely unlike anything I would have chosen for myself. The dress I ended up with was stunning, but when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The reception was filled with Margaret's friends and David's business associates. My family sat at tables in the back, clearly uncomfortable in their rented formal wear, while Margaret held court at the head table, accepting congratulations as if she were the one getting married. But the worst moment came during the mother-son dance. As David twirled his mother around the dance floor, she whispered something in his ear that made him laugh. Then she looked directly at me over his shoulder, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. The look she gave me was pure triumph, as if she were claiming victory in a war I hadn't even realized we were fighting. After the honeymoon, David and I moved into a small apartment in Cambridge while we saved for a house. I thought distance from Margaret might help, but she found ways to maintain her influence. She'd call David multiple times a week, always with some crisis that required his immediate attention: a leaky faucet at the estate, questions about insurance policies, or mysterious problems with her computer that somehow only David could solve. These emergencies always seemed to happen during our planned date nights or weekend getaways. David would look at me apologetically and say, "I'm sorry, honey, but you know how Mother gets when she's stressed. It'll just take an hour." It never took just an hour. Margaret also had strong opinions about our apartment. She'd visit unannounced, always finding something to criticize. The furniture was quaint, but not really suitable for entertaining. The kitchen was cozy, but hardly practical for serious cooking. Our neighborhood was interesting, but perhaps not the best investment for the future. She never directly said she disapproved, but her meaning was crystal clear. This wasn't the life she'd envisioned for her son. When David got the promotion and we started house hunting in Boston, Margaret inserted herself into the process with enthusiasm that should have been a red flag. She had recommendations for realtors, opinions about neighborhoods, and strong feelings about which properties were appropriate for a rising executive and his wife. The house we eventually bought was beautiful, a Victorian townhouse in Back Bay that Margaret had found through her network. It was more expensive than we'd planned and larger than we needed, but David was excited about the investment potential, and I was hopeful that having our own space might finally give us some independence from his mother's constant interference. I should have known better. The day we got the keys, Margaret showed up with a bottle of champagne and a list of suggestions for renovations. She'd already contacted contractors and gotten estimates for updating the kitchen, refinishing the hardwood floors, and completely redoing the master bathroom. The estimates totaled more than we'd budgeted for the entire first year of home ownership. "Think of it as an investment," she said, settling into our living room as if she belonged there. "A house like this deserves to be showcased properly. You'll thank me when it's time to sell." But we weren't planning to sell. We'd bought the house to build a life together, to create our own traditions and memories. Margaret's suggestions would turn our home into another showcase for Richardson family standards, leaving no room for our personal style or preferences. That's when I realized the truth I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Margaret Richardson didn't just disapprove of me. She was actively working to eliminate any trace of who I was from her son's life. The wedding planning hadn't been about creating a perfect day. It had been about establishing dominance. The constant emergencies weren't about needing David's help. They were about maintaining control over his time and attention. And now, the house renovations weren't about improving our investment. They were about ensuring that even in our own home, we'd be living according to her vision of what our life should look like. I started to understand that this battle wasn't really about me at all. It was about David, and whether he would ever truly leave his mother's sphere of influence to build an independent life with his wife. Margaret had spent 32 years shaping her son into the man she wanted him to be, and she wasn't about to let some girl from Kansas undo all her careful work. The question was, would David choose his mother's expectations or his wife's happiness? And more importantly, was I strong enough to force him to make that choice? I was about to find out. The dinner invitation came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Margaret herself in an elegant cream envelope with our names written in her perfect cursive handwriting. David was already at work, so I opened it alone in our kitchen, still wearing my pajamas and nursing my second cup of coffee. "Mr. and Mrs. David Richardson cordially invite you to join them for Sunday dinner at the Richardson estate. 6 o'clock sharp. Dress code, cocktail attire." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I stared at the formal invitation to dinner at my own mother-in-law's house and felt that familiar knot form in my stomach. We'd been married for 8 months, and Margaret had never once invited us for a casual family meal. Every interaction was orchestrated like a diplomatic summit, complete with protocols and unspoken rules I was constantly breaking. But what bothered me most was how she'd addressed the invitation. "Mr. and Mrs. David Richardson," as if I'd completely ceased to exist as an individual person. I wasn't Emma Richardson or even Emma Miller Richardson. I was simply an extension of her son, a nameless appendage to the Richardson family tree. When David came home that evening, he was excited about the invitation. "Mother's finally making an effort," he said, loosening his tie and settling onto our couch. "I told you she'd come around eventually. She probably wants to celebrate the promotion properly." I wanted to share his optimism, but something about the formal tone of the invitation felt more like a summons than a celebration. Margaret Richardson didn't do anything without careful calculation, and I doubted this dinner would be any different. "What should I bring?" I asked. "Wine? Dessert?" David looked puzzled. "You don't bring anything to Mother's dinners. She has everything handled." But I couldn't show up empty-handed. It went against everything my mother had taught me about hospitality and respect. Besides, this felt like an opportunity to show Margaret that I could contribute something meaningful to her son's life, that I wasn't just the Kansas interloper she clearly believed me to be. I spent the rest of the week planning what to make. It had to be something special, something that would showcase my skills while respecting the formality of the occasion. I considered and rejected dozens of options. Too casual, too ethnic, too complicated, too simple. Finally, I settled on my grandmother's lasagna recipe. It was the dish that had made me fall in love with cooking in the first place, passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. But this wouldn't be the version we made for church potlucks back home. I was going to elevate it, using premium ingredients and techniques I'd learned from cooking shows and food blogs. I spent Saturday at the farmer's market, selecting the perfect San Marzano tomatoes, fresh basil that smelled like summer, and the finest imported Parmigiano Reggiano I could afford. The butcher helped me choose a blend of grass-fed beef and Italian sausage, and I found fresh pasta sheets at a little Italian market in the North End. Sunday morning, I was up at 7, starting the sauce that would simmer for hours until it reached the perfect consistency. I roasted the vegetables until they were caramelized and sweet, made fresh ricotta from scratch, and assembled the layers with the precision of an architect building a cathedral. The final product was a work of art, golden brown on top with cheese that bubbled perfectly around the edges, the aroma filling our entire house with warmth and comfort. This wasn't peasant food. This was love made edible. Tradition passed down through generations, elevated with the finest ingredients and careful technique. David found me in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on the presentation. I'd arranged fresh basil leaves on top and dusted everything with freshly grated Parmesan. The whole dish sat in my grandmother's ceramic baking dish, the one my mother had given me when I got married, with tiny roses painted around the rim. "Wow, Em," David said, peering over my shoulder. "That looks incredible. What's the occasion?" "It's for dinner tonight," I said, carefully covering the dish with foil. "I wanted to bring something special." David's expression shifted slightly. "Honey, you know Mother has everything planned. She's probably hired caterers." "I know, but this is important to me. It's my grandmother's recipe, and I thought maybe it could become part of our family traditions too." He kissed my forehead, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Just maybe mention it to her before you serve it? You know how she is about her dinner parties. But this wasn't supposed to be a dinner party. This was supposed to be a family dinner, wasn't it? The kind where everyone contributes something, where recipes get shared and stories get told over. Comfort food made with love. I should have listened to the voice in my head that was screaming warnings. I should have paid attention to David's obvious discomfort, but I was so determined to prove myself, so desperate to find some common ground with Margaret, that I ignored every red flag. We arrived at the Richardson estate at exactly 6 o'clock, me carrying my carefully prepared lasagna and David carrying a bottle of wine from their favorite shop. Margaret answered the door herself, which was unusual. Normally, their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, handled arrivals. Margaret looked stunning in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my car payment. Her silver hair perfectly styled and her jewelry understated but clearly expensive. She air-kissed David's cheeks and gave me that familiar smile that never reached her eyes. "Emma, dear," she said, her gaze dropping to the dish in my hands. "What do you have there?" "I made lasagna," I said, trying to match her confident tone. "It's my grandmother's recipe, but I used San Marzano tomatoes and fresh pasta from that place in the North End." For just a moment, Margaret's composed mask slipped, and I saw something flash across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. But she recovered quickly, her smile never wavering. "How thoughtful," she said. "Though I'm afraid I've already prepared everything for this evening. Mrs. Chen has been cooking all day." "Oh, that's fine," I said quickly. "This can be a side dish, or we can save it for later. I just wanted to contribute something." Margaret's laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane, pretty on the surface but with an underlying sharpness that made you want to seek shelter. "Well, aren't you sweet? Come in, both of you. Charles is in the library." She led us through the marble foyer, past oil paintings of long-dead Richardsons and furniture that belonged in museums. The dining room was set for 3 with Margaret's finest china, the Spode set that had belonged to David's great-grandmother and only came out for the most special occasions. Everything was perfect, of course. Crystal glasses caught the light. From the chandelier, silver gleamed against white linen, and fresh white roses created an elegant centerpiece. This was the kind of table setting that appeared in home and garden magazines, the kind that made you afraid to breathe too hard in case you disturbed the perfection. Charles Richardson emerged from the library with his usual warm smile, the one trait David had inherited from his father. Where Margaret was all sharp edges and careful control, Charles was genuinely kind, though I'd learned over the past 2 years that his kindness often came with a price. He rarely stood up to his wife when it mattered. "Emma, my dear," he said, giving me a real hug, not one of Margaret's air kiss performances. "You look lovely. And what's this you've brought?" "I made lasagna," I said, grateful for his genuine interest. "It's been in my family for generations, but I tried to make it special for tonight." "How wonderful," Charles said, and I could tell he meant it. Nothing beats a home-cooked meal made with love. Margaret's spine stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, well, shall we have cocktails in the living room before dinner? I've prepared beef Wellington tonight, Charles's favorite." Of course she had. Beef Wellington was the kind of dish that required hours of preparation and perfect timing, the culinary equivalent of a military operation. It was also David's favorite meal, the one Margaret made for his birthday every year, and whenever she wanted to remind him of home. We moved to the living room, where Margaret had prepared a full bar setup with crystal decanters and silver ice buckets. She mixed cocktails with the efficiency of a professional bartender, her movements precise and practiced. David and his father fell into easy conversation about work and golf, their familiar rhythm excluding me as effectively as a locked door. I sat on the edge of an antique sofa that was probably worth more than my annual salary, still holding my lasagna and feeling increasingly foolish. Margaret had made it clear that my contribution wasn't needed or wanted, but she'd done it so politely that I couldn't even be properly angry about it. This was her specialty, making people feel unwelcome, while maintaining perfect hostess etiquette. She was like a master surgeon, cutting with precision while leaving no visible scars. "Emma, dear," Margaret said, settling into her chair with her martini, "would you mind putting your dish in the kitchen? I'm sure Mrs. Chen can find somewhere to store it." It was phrased as a request, but her tone made it clear this wasn't optional. I stood up, my cheeks burning with embarrassment, and made my way to the kitchen. Mrs. Chen was there, putting the finishing touches on what looked like a 5-course meal that could have fed a small army. "Oh, you brought something," she said kindly, noticing my dish. "It smells wonderful." "Where should I put this?" I asked, feeling like an intruder in the professionally organized kitchen. "Here, let me make room in the refrigerator," Mrs. Chen said, moving things around to accommodate my amateur offering. "Maybe we can warm it up later if there's room." But I knew there wouldn't be room. Margaret had planned this evening down to the last detail, and my lasagna wasn't part of her vision. I was just the daughter-in-law who didn't know her place, who'd had the audacity to think she could contribute something to a Richardson family dinner. When I returned to the living room, the conversation had moved on to vacation plans. Margaret was describing their upcoming trip to Martha's Vineyard, the same house they'd been visiting every summer for 30 years. David's eyes lit up as he talked about childhood memories of sailing and beach bonfires, a world I'd never been part of and probably never would be. "You'll have to come with us this year, Emma," Charles said warmly. "We always have room for one more." "Oh, I'm not sure about this year," Margaret interjected smoothly. "The house is being renovated, and you know how cramped it gets with construction. Maybe next summer when everything's finished." There it was again, the polite exclusion, the reasonable excuse that couldn't be argued with. I was being systematically edited out of their family traditions, one reasonable explanation at a time. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock sharp, and it was undeniably spectacular. The beef Wellington was perfect, the side dishes were restaurant quality, and every course was presented with the kind of attention to detail that would have impressed a Michelin-starred chef. Margaret had outdone herself, creating a meal that was both delicious and intimidating. Throughout dinner, She regaled us with stories of her cooking adventures, the classes she'd taken in France, the famous chefs she'd met at charity events. Each story was a subtle reminder of her sophistication, her connections, her superior knowledge of all things culinary. I sat quietly, cutting my beef into smaller and smaller pieces, my grandmother's lasagna growing cold in the kitchen while I listened to Margaret establish her dominance in the one area where I'd thought I might have something to offer. By the time dessert was served, a perfect crème brûlée with berries from Margaret's own garden, I felt completely deflated. Every time I'd tried to contribute to the conversation, Margaret had either ignored me or redirected the discussion to something I knew nothing about. I was a spectator at my own family dinner, watching my husband reconnect with the world I could never fully enter. The final blow came as we were getting ready to leave. I remembered my lasagna and went back to the kitchen to retrieve it, thinking we could at least take it home and enjoy it later. But when I opened the refrigerator, the dish was gone. "Mrs. Chen?" I called out, but the kitchen was empty. The evening staff had already cleaned up and left. I found Margaret in the foyer, helping David with his coat. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know what happened to my lasagna? I left it in the refrigerator." Margaret's expression was perfectly innocent, but there was something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. "Oh, that," she said dismissively. "I had Mrs. Chen dispose of it. The refrigerator was getting quite crowded, and we certainly didn't need the extra food going to waste." The words hit me like a physical blow. She'd thrown away my grandmother's recipe, the dish I'd spent hours preparing with the finest ingredients I could afford. She'd taken something I'd made with love and literally put it in the trash as if it were garbage. But worse than that, she'd done it knowing exactly what it would mean to me. This wasn't about refrigerator space or food waste. This was about power, about putting me in my place once and for all. "You threw it away?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well, yes, dear," Margaret said, her tone suggesting I was being unreasonable for even asking. "It's not as if anyone was going to eat it. We'd already had such a lovely dinner." David was checking his phone, oblivious to what had just happened. Charles had disappeared back into the library. It was just me and Margaret in the marble foyer, having the confrontation that had been building for 2 years. And in that moment, looking at her perfectly composed face and seeing the calculated cruelty behind her polite smile, I realized that this wasn't going to end with apologies or understanding. Margaret Richardson had just declared war, and she'd chosen her battlefield carefully. My grandmother's lasagna wasn't just food to her. It was everything I represented. The working-class background she despised, the family traditions she considered beneath her standards, the influence she was determined to eliminate from her son's life. She'd thrown away my offering like garbage, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd shown me exactly who she really was, stripped away all the polite pretense and revealed the ruthless woman underneath. And now I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with patience and kindness. This was a battle for my place in my own marriage, and Margaret had just fired the first shot. The car ride home was suffocating. David hummed along to the classical music station, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was sitting beside him in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. The Boston skyline blurred past my window as I replayed Margaret's words over and over in my mind. "Peasant food doesn't belong here." She hadn't actually said those exact words at the dinner, but her actions had screamed them louder than any verbal assault could have. The way she'd dismissed my grandmother's recipe, the casual cruelty of throwing it away like actual garbage, and the satisfied gleam in her eyes when she told me about it, it all painted a picture I could no longer ignore. That was nice, wasn't it? David said as we pulled into our driveway. "I think Mother's really starting to warm up to you. She seemed more relaxed tonight." I stared at him in disbelief. Had we been at the same dinner? Had he somehow missed the systematic way his mother had excluded me from every conversation, dismissed my contribution, and then literally thrown my food in the trash? "David," I said carefully, "did you notice what happened with the lasagna I brought?" "The lasagna?" He looked genuinely confused as he turned off the engine. "What about it?" "Your mother threw it away. She had Mrs. Chen put it in the garbage because she said the refrigerator was too crowded." David frowned, but not in the way I'd hoped. Instead of outrage or even concern, he looked mildly annoyed. At me. "Emma, you know Mother had everything planned for tonight. Maybe bringing your own food wasn't the best idea." The words hit me like a slap. My own husband was defending his mother's behavior, making me feel like I was the problem for daring to contribute something homemade to a family dinner. "It wasn't just my own food, David. It was my grandmother's recipe. I spent hours making it with the best ingredients I could afford. I wanted to share something meaningful with your family." "I understand that, honey, but you have to see it from Mother's perspective. She spent all day preparing that meal, and then you show up with something she didn't plan for. Maybe she just didn't want you to feel obligated to serve it when she'd already prepared so much." I could feel my chest tightening with frustration. David had an explanation for everything, a way to rationalize his mother's behavior that made me sound unreasonable for being hurt by it. This was the pattern that had defined our relationship with Margaret from the beginning. She would do something cruel, David would find a way to excuse it, and I would be left feeling like I was losing my mind. "She could have saved it for later," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Or we could have taken it home. Instead, she waited until I asked about it and then told me she'd thrown it away. She wanted me to know what she'd done." David sighed, the kind of long-suffering sigh that suggested I was being dramatic again. "Emma, I think you're reading too much into this. Mother isn't malicious. She's just particular about how she does things." Particularly. That was David's favorite word for describing his mother's behavior. Not cruel, not manipulative, not deliberately hurtful, just particular. As if her systematic campaign to undermine me was simply a quirky personality trait rather than a calculated assault on my place in the family. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside me. I thought about my grandmother, who had taught me that recipe when I was 12 years old, standing on a step stool in her tiny kitchen in Topeka. She'd told me that food was love made tangible, that feeding people was one of the most fundamental ways to show you cared about them. Margaret had taken that love and literally thrown it in the garbage. And my husband couldn't even see why that hurt. The next morning, David left for work as usual, kissing my forehead and promising we'd talk more later. But I knew we wouldn't really talk. He'd find ways to minimize what had happened, to explain away his mother's behavior until I felt like the problem was all in my head. I called in sick to work and spent the day walking around Boston, trying to clear my head. I ended up in the North End, wandering past the Italian market where I'd bought the fresh pasta for my ruined lasagna. The elderly man behind the counter recognized me and asked how the dish had turned out. "It was perfect," I lied, not wanting to explain the humiliation to a stranger. But as I walked away, I realized it wasn't entirely a lie. The lasagna had been perfect. The sauce had simmered to the ideal consistency. The cheese had melted exactly right, and the layers had held together beautifully when I'd cut the first slice to check. The problem wasn't with my cooking. It was with Margaret's complete inability to accept anything I brought to her son's life. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my mother. "Emma!" Mom's voice was bright with surprise. "What a lovely surprise. How are you, sweetheart?" I'd been holding it together all day, but hearing my mother's warm, familiar voice broke something loose inside me. The whole story came pouring out. The dinner invitation, my careful preparation, Margaret's casual cruelty, and David's maddening refusal to see what his mother was doing. Mom listened without interrupting, making the occasional sympathetic sound that let me know she was really hearing me. When I finally finished, there was a long pause. "Honey," she said gently, "this isn't about lasagna." "I know that," I said, wiping my eyes with a tissue. "But I don't know what to do about it. David thinks I'm overreacting to everything. Have you told him how this is making you feel? Not just about last night, but about everything that's been building up. Every time I try, he has an excuse for her behavior. She's protective. She's particular. She means well. There's always a reason why I should just accept it and not make waves." Mom was quiet for a moment. "You know, your father's mother wasn't thrilled when he married me either. She thought he could do better than a girl whose daddy worked at the grain elevator." I'd heard hints of this story before, but Mom had never talked about it directly. "What happened?" "Well, she made her feelings pretty clear in little ways. Nothing you could really call her out on, but enough to make me feel unwelcome. And your father, bless his heart, tried to keep the peace by pretending it wasn't happening. How did you handle it?" "I didn't, for a long time. I kept trying to win her over, making her favorite cookies, remembering her birthday, being as sweet as pie whenever she was around. But the harder I tried, the more she seemed to enjoy making me squirm." This sounded painfully familiar. "When did it change?" "When your father finally saw what she was doing." It took him a while. Men don't always pick up on the subtle stuff, but eventually even he couldn't ignore it. And once he understood what was happening, he set some boundaries. "What kind of boundaries?" "He told his mother that he loved her, but that I was his wife, and if she couldn't treat me with respect, we wouldn't be spending much time around her." It was hard for him. He hated confrontation. But he realized he had to choose between keeping his mother happy and protecting his marriage. I felt a flutter of hope in my chest. And it worked? Eventually. She never loved me, but she learned to be civil, and more importantly, I learned that I didn't need her approval to be happy in my marriage. But Emma, honey, the key was that your father stood up for me. Without that, nothing would have changed. After we hung up, I sat in our living room looking at the wedding photos on the mantel. In every picture, David and I looked so happy, so confident about our future together. But in the background of several shots, I could see Margaret watching us with that same calculating expression I'd seen at dinner the night before. Had she been planning this campaign from the beginning? Had she looked at our wedding photos and seen not her son's happiness, but a threat to her control over his life? My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you." It was barely 4 o'clock, and he was already making excuses to avoid coming home. I wondered if he was really working late, or if he just didn't want to deal with his wife's dramatics about his mother. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I called Margaret directly. "Richardson residence. This is Margaret speaking." Her voice was crisp and professional, the tone she used for business calls or people she didn't know well. When she realized it was me, the temperature dropped several degrees. "Emma, how unexpected. Is everything all right? Is David with you?" "David's fine," I said, my heart pounding. "I wanted to talk to you about last night." "Oh?" The single word was loaded with wariness. "I wanted to understand why you threw away my lasagna. I spent a lot of time and effort preparing it, and I was hurt that you just discarded it without even trying it." There was a long pause, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice had taken on that familiar tone of patient condescension. "Emma, dear, I think you may have misunderstood the situation. Mrs. Chen was simply clearing out the refrigerator. We can't let food sit around indefinitely." It had been there for less than 2 hours. Yes, well, safety first. You can never be too careful with homemade dishes, especially ones involving dairy and meat. Professional kitchens have strict protocols about these things. She was doing it again, making my perfectly safe, carefully prepared food sound like a health hazard while maintaining plausible deniability about her real motives. "Margaret," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice, "can we please be honest with each other? I know you don't approve of me, and I know you wish David had married someone else. But I am his wife, and I'm trying to be part of this family." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke, the pretense was gone from her voice, replaced by ice-cold clarity. "You're right, Emma. I don't think you're right for my son. You come from a completely different world, and you don't understand the responsibilities that come with being a Richardson. David has a certain position to maintain, certain expectations to meet, and frankly, I'm not sure you're equipped to help him meet them." The honesty was almost refreshing after months of passive-aggressive manipulation. At least now the battle lines were clearly drawn. "What exactly do you think I'm not equipped for? David needs a partner who understands his social obligations, who can move in the right circles, who can be an asset to his career. Someone who knows the difference between a family dinner and a potluck supper." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. I wasn't from their world, and I did struggle with the unspoken rules of Boston society. But I was learning, and more importantly, I loved David for who he was, not for his family name or his trust fund. "I may not have grown up with money," I said, "but I know how to love your son. I know how to support his dreams and make him happy. Isn't that worth something?" "Love is a luxury, dear. Marriage is a partnership, and partnerships require compatible backgrounds and shared values. You and David may think you're compatible now, but wait until the novelty wears off. Wait until he realizes what he's given up to be with someone who doesn't fit into his world." The cruelty of her words took my breath away, but there was something else in her voice, a kind of desperate urgency that made me wonder if she actually believed what she was saying or if she was just trying to convince herself that her campaign against me was justified. "Margaret," I said quietly, "what are you so afraid of?" "I'm not afraid of anything," she snapped, but I could hear the lie in her voice. "You are. You're afraid that David is going to choose me over you, and you're right to be afraid. Because he already has. He married me, he built a life with me, and no matter how hard you try to drive us apart, that's not going to change." "We'll see about that," Margaret said, and hung up. I sat staring at the phone in my hand, replaying the conversation in my mind. For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret Richardson had dropped her mask completely. She'd shown me her true feelings, her real motivations, and her ultimate goal, to destroy my marriage so she could reclaim her son. But she'd also revealed something else. She was scared. Scared that despite all her money and social connections and carefully orchestrated manipulation, she might lose the war for David's loyalty. And that fear made her dangerous in a way I was only beginning to understand. When David came home that night, not as late as he'd predicted, I was waiting for him with a decision already made. I couldn't keep fighting this battle alone, trying to win over a woman who had no intention of ever accepting me. It was time to force David to see what his mother was really doing to our marriage. It was time to make him choose. The moment David walked through our front door that evening, I knew everything was about to change. He found me in the living room, sitting in the same chair where I'd been processing Margaret's phone call for hours, trying to figure out how to move forward from her brutal honesty about wanting to destroy our marriage. "You look like you've seen a ghost," David said, setting down his briefcase and loosening his tie. "Rough day?" I studied my husband's face, the same face I'd fallen in love with 4 years ago, the one that still made my heart skip when he smiled at me over breakfast. But tonight, I was seeing him differently. Tonight, I was wondering if the man I'd married would be strong enough to stand up to the woman who'd raised him. "I had an interesting conversation with your mother today," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. David froze in the middle of unbuttoning his shirt. "You called Mother? Emma, what did you say to her?" The way he asked the question, Not, what did she say to you, but what did you say to her? Told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties still lay. Even after everything that had happened, his first instinct was to worry about his mother's feelings, not his wife's. I asked her why she threw away my lasagna, I said simply. David's shoulders sagged with relief. Oh. Well, I'm sure she explained about the refrigerator space and food safety. Mother's always been careful about those things. She did explain, David. She explained that she doesn't think I'm good enough for you and that she's waiting for you to realize you made a mistake marrying me. The color drained from David's face so quickly I thought he might faint. He sank onto the couch across from me, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. She said that. Those exact words. Among other things. We had quite an enlightening conversation about what she really thinks of our marriage and her plans for our future. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as his way of buying time when he didn't know how to respond. Emma, I'm sure there was some kind of misunderstanding. Mother can be blunt sometimes, but she wouldn't— David, stop. The sharpness in my voice cut through his automatic deflection. Just stop. For once in our marriage, can you please not make excuses for your mother's behavior? He looked stung by my tone, but I was past caring about his feelings. I was tired of being the only one in our marriage who seemed to understand that we had a problem. I'm not making excuses, he said defensively. I'm just trying to understand what happened. You know how Mother is. Yes, I do know how your mother is. That's exactly the problem. I stood up and walked to our bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound photo album Margaret had given us as a wedding gift. David, I want to show you something. I opened the album to the first page, where Margaret had carefully arranged photos from our engagement party. Every picture showed David with various family members and friends, but in each one, I was either cut out of the frame or positioned at the very edge, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Look at these photos, I said, setting the album on the coffee table between us. Really look at them. David glanced at the pages reluctantly. They're nice photos, Em. What's your point? My point is that your mother chose these specific photos, out of dozens that were taken that night. She picked the ones where I look awkward or where I'm barely visible. She created a visual narrative of your engagement party that essentially erased me from the story. I flipped through more pages, showing him the pattern that continued throughout our wedding album, photos where Margaret looked radiant and I looked tense, pictures of David with his family where I was conveniently obscured by other people, group shots where everyone was smiling except me, caught mid-blink or with an expression of confusion. This wasn't accidental, David. Your mother curated these photos to tell a specific story, one where I don't belong. David studied the album with growing unease. I could see him starting to notice things he'd never paid attention to before. The way Margaret had positioned herself between us in family photos, the way she'd consistently chosen unflattering shots of me while selecting the most beautiful ones of herself. Maybe you're reading too much into this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Let me ask you something. When was the last time your mother asked about my job, or my family? Or anything about my life that doesn't directly relate to you? David opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. I could see him mentally scrolling through their conversations, searching for evidence that his mother had ever shown genuine interest in me as a person. She asks how you're doing, he said weakly. No. She asks how I'm adjusting to married life, or if I'm keeping you happy. She's never once asked about my graphic design work, even though I love what I do. She's never remembered my mother's name, even though I've mentioned her dozens of times. She knows nothing about me except that I married her son, and she clearly wishes I hadn't. I could see the wheels turning in David's mind, finally processing years of interactions through a new lens. The wife he'd dismissed as oversensitive was showing him pattern after pattern of deliberate exclusion and subtle cruelty. "But why would she do that?" he asked, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely confused rather than defensive. "What does she gain from making you feel unwelcome?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for 3 years, and I finally had an answer that made sense of everything. "Control," I said simply. "As long as I'm the problem in your family, as long as I'm the source of tension and conflict, she maintains control over your attention and loyalty. Think about it. How many times have you chosen to avoid family events or cut visits short because you knew I'd be uncomfortable?" David's face went pale as he realized what I was getting at. "Every time you do that, you're choosing me over her, which makes her feel like she's losing you. But instead of accepting that you're a married man who's built a life with someone else, she's decided that I'm the obstacle to remove." That's crazy," David said, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "Is it? Think about Sarah Whitman. How many times has your mother mentioned her in the past year? How many times has she told you about Sarah's promotion at the law firm, or her new apartment, or how beautiful she looked at some charity event?" David looked uncomfortable. "Mother's known Sarah's family for years. They're old friends. Sarah's single. David. Sarah's successful. She's from the right family. And she's everything your mother wanted you to marry. And your mother makes sure to keep her name in your consciousness, to remind you what you could have had if you hadn't settled for the girl from Kansas." I watched David process this information, seeing the recognition dawn in his eyes. Sarah Whitman wasn't just a family friend in Margaret's mind. She was the alternative to me, the path not taken that could still be chosen if I were somehow removed from the picture. "Emma, even if Mother does have some reservations about our marriage, she wouldn't actually try to break us up. She's not that manipulative." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "David, your mother spent our entire engagement party introducing me to people as David's friend from Kansas. Not his fiancé, not his girlfriend, his friend. She knew exactly what she was doing. That was 3 years ago. People make mistakes. It wasn't a mistake. It was a test. She wanted to see if you'd correct her, if you'd stand up for our relationship. And when you didn't, she knew she could get away with more." The silence stretched between us as David grappled with a reality he'd been avoiding for years. His mother, the woman who'd raised him and shaped his values, was actively working to sabotage his marriage. "What did she say to you today?" he asked finally. "The whole conversation, not just the parts about you not being good enough." I took a deep breath and told him everything. Margaret's comments about my background, her concerns about my ability to be an asset to his career, her belief that love was a luxury and marriage was a business partnership. I told him about her dismissive attitude toward my family traditions and her conviction that I would never truly fit into their world. But most importantly, I told him about the threat I'd heard in her voice when she'd said, "We'll see about that," before hanging up on me. "She's escalating, David. The subtle manipulation isn't working fast enough for her, so she's going to get more direct. And I need to know, when she does, whose side are you going to be on?" David was quiet for a long time, staring at the wedding album with its carefully curated narrative of our relationship. When he finally looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, not just understanding, but anger. "I'm on your side," he said quietly. "I should have been all along." "Are you?" Because being on my side means more than just saying the right words. It means setting boundaries with your mother, even when it makes you uncomfortable. It means choosing our marriage over her approval. "What do you need me to do?" The question I'd been waiting 3 years to hear. "I need you to call your mother tomorrow and tell her that her behavior toward me is unacceptable. I need you to make it clear that if she wants a relationship with you, she needs to treat your wife with respect." David nodded slowly. "And if she refuses, then we'll know where we stand. But David, I need you to understand something. This isn't going to end with one phone call. Your mother has invested too much in trying to control your life to give up easily. She's going to fight back, and she's going to try to make you feel guilty for choosing me over her. I can handle Mother, David said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Can you? Because she's had 32 years to perfect her methods of manipulation. She knows exactly which buttons to push to make you doubt yourself and your decisions. David reached across the coffee table and took my hands in his. Emma, I love you. I married you because I wanted to build a life with you, not because I was rebelling against my family or making some kind of statement. You're not a mistake I need to realize. You're the best decision I ever made. I squeezed his hands, feeling tears prick at my eyes. Then prove it. When your mother tries to convince you that I'm the problem, when she tells you that you'd be happier without me, when she offers you a way back to the life she planned for you, prove that you meant what you just said. That night we talked until almost dawn. David apologized for the years of dismissing my concerns, for making me fight this battle alone, for allowing his mother to make me feel unwelcome in my own family. I apologized for not being more direct about what I needed from him, for letting resentment build instead of forcing earlier confrontations. But mostly, we planned. We talked about the boundaries we needed to set, the consequences we'd enforce if those boundaries were crossed, and the life we wanted to build together, one that honored both of our backgrounds while being controlled by neither of our families. I finally drifted off to sleep in David's arms. I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years of marriage: hope. Not just that things might get better, but that my husband was finally ready to fight for our relationship instead of just trying to keep the peace. But I also knew that the real test was still coming. Margaret Richardson had just lost the first major battle in her campaign to reclaim her son, and she wasn't going to surrender quietly. The phone call David promised to make would either establish the respect and boundaries we desperately needed, or it would mark the beginning of an all-out war for the soul of our marriage. Either way, there was no going back. The time for pretending everything was fine had passed, and everyone would have to choose where they stood. David stood in our kitchen the next morning, holding his phone like it was a loaded weapon. He'd been psyching himself up for the call, to his mother for 20 minutes, pacing between the coffee maker and the window, rehearsing what he was going to say under his breath. You don't have to do this right now, I said gently, watching him struggle with 32 years of conditioning. We could wait until— No, David said firmly, though his hand was shaking slightly. If I don't do this now, I'll find an excuse to put it off. And you've waited long enough for me to stand up for you. I nodded and retreated to the living room, giving him space but staying close enough to offer support if he needed it. Through the open doorway, I could see him take a deep breath and dial his mother's number. The phone rang 3 times before Margaret's crisp voice answered. Richardson residence. Mother, it's David. Do you have a few minutes? I need to talk to you about something important. Of course, darling. You sound serious. Is everything all right? Margaret's tone was warm and concerned, the perfect mother worried about her son. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed the performance myself. David glanced toward the living room, and I gave him an encouraging nod. Actually, no. Everything's not all right. I need to talk to you about your relationship with Emma. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice had cooled several degrees. Oh? Has something happened? Emma told me about your conversation yesterday, David said, his voice gaining strength. About how you threw away the lasagna she made for Sunday dinner, and about the things you said to her when she called to ask about it. David, dear, I think there may have been some misunderstanding. You know how sensitive Emma can be about these things. I had to grip the arm of my chair to keep from marching into the kitchen. Even now, even when caught red-handed, Margaret was trying to gaslight her way out of accountability by painting me as the overly emotional wife who couldn't handle reality. There was no misunderstanding, Mother, David said, and I felt a surge of pride at the firmness in his voice. Emma told me exactly what you said to her, and I believe her. More than that, I've been thinking about your behavior toward my wife for the past 3 years, and I don't like what I'm seeing. My behavior? Margaret's voice sharpened with indignation. David, I have been nothing but welcoming to that girl since the day you brought her home. If she's been filling your head with stories, she hasn't been filling my head with anything, David interrupted, and I could hear him getting angry now. I've been blind to what's been happening, but I'm not blind anymore. I see how you exclude her from conversations, how you change the subject whenever she talks about her work or her family. I see how you've positioned yourself between us in every family photo, how you've made her feel like an outsider at every family gathering. That's ridiculous. Is it? When was the last time you asked Emma about something that didn't relate directly to me? When was the last time you remembered her mother's name or showed any interest in her career? Margaret was quiet for a moment, probably scrambling to come up with examples that didn't exist. I care about Emma's happiness, she said finally, but my primary concern has always been yours. I'm your mother, David. It's my job to want what's best for you. And you've decided that Emma isn't what's best for me? Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear Margaret calculating her response, trying to find a way to express her true feelings without completely destroying her relationship with her son. I think you're at different stages in your lives, she said carefully. You have certain responsibilities, certain expectations that come with your position and your family name. I'm not sure Emma fully understands what that means. What it means, David said, his voice tight with controlled anger, is that you think my wife isn't good enough for me because she didn't grow up with money. It's not about money, David. It's about compatibility, about shared values and backgrounds. You and Sarah Whitman, for instance, don't. David's voice cut through his mother's words like a blade. Don't you dare bring up Sarah. I didn't marry Sarah, Mother. I married Emma. Emma is my wife, the woman I chose to build a life with. And if you can't respect that choice, then we have a serious problem. I could hear Margaret's sharp intake of breath through the phone. This wasn't the conversation she'd expected to have. This wasn't the compliant son who usually bent to her will when she applied the right pressure. Of course I respect your choice, she said, but her voice was strained. I just want you to be happy, and if Emma makes you happy, she does make me happy. She makes me happier than I've ever been in my life. And the only thing that's threatening, that happiness is your treatment of her. David, you're being unfair. I have never done anything to deliberately hurt Emma. You threw away food she spent hours preparing with the finest ingredients she could afford. You told her to her face that she's not equipped to be my wife. You've spent 3 years systematically excluding her from family traditions and making her feel unwelcome at every turn. If that's not deliberately hurtful, then what is? Margaret's careful composure was starting to crack. I never said she wasn't equipped. You said she doesn't understand the responsibilities of being a Richardson. You said love is a luxury, and marriage is a partnership that requires compatible backgrounds. You told my wife that you're waiting for me to realize I made a mistake marrying her. I was concerned you were manipulating, and it stops now. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could picture Margaret in her pristine living room, probably clutching her phone with white knuckles as her carefully constructed world began to crumble around her. What exactly are you saying, David? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that if you want to have a relationship with me, you need to treat my wife with respect. Real respect, not the polite tolerance you've been showing her. Emma is part of my life now, permanently, and anyone who can't accept that will find themselves with a very limited role in our future. You're giving me an ultimatum? I'm setting a boundary. There's a difference. Margaret laughed. But there was no humor in it. A boundary? Is that what Emma calls it? This isn't about Emma, Mother. This is about me finally recognizing what kind of man I want to be. I want to be the kind of husband who protects his wife from people who would hurt her, even if those people are family. I would never hurt Emma. You already have hurt her. Repeatedly. And you've hurt me by forcing me to choose between my mother's approval and my wife's happiness. That's not a choice a mother should force her son to make. I could hear Margaret starting to cry on the other end of the line, and despite everything she'd put me through, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. This was her worst nightmare coming true, losing control of her son, watching him choose his wife over his family of origin. "David, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't let that girl turn you against your own family. We've always been so close. We can still be close, Mother, but not at Emma's expense. Not if it means treating my wife like she's not good enough to be part of this family." "What do you want from me?" Margaret asked, and for the first time in the conversation, she sounded genuinely defeated. "I want you to apologize to Emma for the way you've treated her. I want you to make an effort to get to know her as a person, not just as your son's wife. I want you to include her in family traditions instead of finding ways to exclude her. And I want you to stop trying to convince me that I made a mistake marrying her." And if I can't do those things? David was quiet for a long moment, and I knew he was wrestling with the hardest part of this conversation. "Then we'll have to limit our contact with you. Emma and I are a package deal now, Mother. You can't have a relationship with me while actively working to destroy my marriage." Margaret's sob was audible through the phone. "You would choose her over your own mother?" "I would choose my marriage over anyone who tries to destroy it, including you." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at Margaret's feet. For 32 years, she'd been the most important woman in her son's life, the one whose opinions mattered most, whose approval he sought above all others. Now she was being told that another woman had taken that place, and that her behavior toward that woman would determine her own future relationship with her son. "I need time to think about this," Margaret said finally, her voice hollow. "Take all the time you need," David replied. "But understand that while you're thinking, Emma and I are moving forward with our lives, with or without your blessing." "David, I love you, Mother. I'll always love you. But I won't let you destroy my marriage in the name of that love." He hung up before she could respond, then stood staring at the phone in his hand like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. I waited a moment before joining him in the kitchen, giving him space to process what had just happened. When I finally approached him, he looked up at me with a mixture of relief and devastation. "How do you feel?" I asked gently. "Like I just declared war on my own mother," he said, sinking into one of our kitchen chairs. "But also like I should have done this years ago." I sat down across from him and reached for his hands. "You did the right thing, David. It was hard, but it was right." Was it? Because she sounded so hurt, and I know I'm all she has. "No," I interrupted. "You're not all she has. She has your father, she has her friends, she has her social commitments and charitable work. What she doesn't have is unlimited control over your life, and that's what this is really about." David nodded, but I could see the guilt eating at him. 32 years of being the perfect son didn't disappear overnight, and Margaret had played her final card expertly, making him feel responsible for her pain. "She's going to call back," I said, "probably within the hour. And when she does, she's going to try every manipulation tactic she knows to get you to back down from what you just said." "What kind of tactics?" "Guilt, mostly. She'll tell you how much you've hurt her, how ungrateful you're being after everything she's done for you. She might bring up your father's health or her own, make you feel like you're abandoning her when she needs you most." David's face paled. "She wouldn't use Dad's health issues to manipulate me." "Wouldn't she?" "David, your mother just lost the most important battle of her life. She's going to use every weapon in her arsenal to win it back." As if on cue, David's phone rang. We both looked at the caller ID. Margaret Richardson. "Don't answer it," I said quickly. "Not yet. You need time to process what just happened without her voice in your head telling you that you were wrong." David stared at the ringing phone, his finger hovering over the answer button. For a moment, I thought 32 years of conditioning would win out, that he'd answer the call and let his mother begin the process of undermining everything he'd just accomplished. But then he turned the phone face down on the table and let it ring through to voicemail. "There," he said, looking up at me with something like wonder in his eyes. I just ignored a call from my mother for the first time in my adult life. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying," he admitted. "But also liberating?" The phone buzzed with a voicemail notification, then immediately started ringing again. Margaret wasn't giving up easily. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," I warned him. "Your mother is going to pull out all the stops to get you back under her control. Are you ready for that?" David looked at the ringing phone, then at me, then back at the phone. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "I'm ready. Whatever she throws at us, we'll handle it together." The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Margaret Richardson was about to show us exactly how far she was willing to go to win back her son, and we were about to find out if our marriage was strong enough to survive the battle that was coming. Margaret's campaign began within hours. The PI first voicemail was wounded and maternal, her voice thick with tears as she talked about how shocked and hurt she was by David's accusations. The second was more strategic, mentioning how this stress was affecting Charles's blood pressure and wondering aloud if David really wanted to be responsible for his father's health crisis. By the third voicemail, the gloves were coming off. "David, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I believe Emma has poisoned your mind against your own family. This isn't the son I raised, turning on his mother for some girl he's known for 4 years. I think you need to seriously consider whether this marriage is worth destroying the relationships you've had your entire life." David deleted that message without listening to the rest, but I could see the impact it had on him. His mother knew exactly which pressure points to hit, exactly how to make him doubt himself and the decisions he'd made. The calls continued throughout the day. When David stopped answering his personal phone, Margaret started calling his office. When his assistant began screening those calls, she contacted David's colleagues, expressing concern about his stress levels and asking them to check on him. "She called Harrison McKnight," David said, coming home from work looking shell-shocked. "My boss's boss. She told him she was worried about my mental state and thought I might need some time off to deal with family issues." I felt my blood run cold. Margaret wasn't just trying to manipulate David emotionally anymore. She was actively trying to sabotage his career. "What did McKnight say?" He was confused but polite. "Said if I needed time off, I should go through proper channels." "But Emma, she's escalating this in ways I never imagined. What if she starts spreading rumors about my stability? What if she tries to damage my professional reputation?" This was exactly what I'd feared would happen. Margaret Richardson was a woman who'd spent decades navigating Boston's social and business networks, building relationships and accumulating favors. If she decided to wage war against us, she had weapons we couldn't match. "We need to document everything," I said. "Every call, every voicemail, every contact she makes with your colleagues. If this escalated further, we'll need evidence of harassment." David looked overwhelmed by the idea that his own mother could be classified as a harasser, but he nodded and started writing down the timeline of Margaret's contacts. As we worked, his phone buzzed with yet another call from his parents' house. This time, it wasn't Margaret. It was Charles. "Dad?" David answered cautiously, putting the phone on speaker so I could hear. "Son, your mother is beside herself. She's been crying for hours, won't eat, won't leave her room. I don't understand what happened between you two, but she says you've threatened to cut her out of your life entirely." I could hear the genuine concern in Charles's voice, and I felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was caught in the middle of a war he probably didn't fully understand, watching his wife fall apart without knowing why. "Dad, that's not what I said. I told Mother that if she wants a relationship with me, she needs to treat Emma with respect. That's not unreasonable. Of course it's not, son. But your mother says Emma has been telling you lies about her, turning you against your own family. She's talking about calling Dr. Brennan to prescribe something for her nerves. Margaret was pulling out all the stops now, positioning herself as the victim of my manipulation while threatening her own health to guilt David into backing down. It was a masterclass in emotional blackmail. Dad, Emma hasn't told me any lies. I've finally started paying attention to things I should have noticed years ago. Mother has been systematically excluding Emma from family events and making her feel unwelcome in subtle but deliberate ways. David, that can't be right. Your mother adores Emma. No, she doesn't. She threw away food Emma spent hours preparing and told her to her face that she's not good enough to be my wife. She's been waging a campaign to break up my marriage, and I won't tolerate it anymore. Charles was quiet for a long moment. Son, are you sure you're not overreacting? Your mother can be particular about social situations, but she's not malicious. There it was again, that word David always used to excuse his mother's behavior. Even Charles had been conditioned to minimize Margaret's cruelty as mere pickiness. Dad, I love you, and I respect you, but I need you to stay out of this. This is between Mother and me, and it's not going to be resolved by making me feel guilty about her emotional state. But David, she's your mother. Surely whatever she's done can be forgiven. It can be forgiven, but not forgotten, and not repeated. If Mother wants my forgiveness, she can start by apologizing to Emma for 3 years of disrespectful treatment. After David hung up, we sat in our kitchen feeling like we were under siege. Margaret had mobilized her entire network, family, friends, professional contacts, to pressure David into submission. She was using every relationship she'd cultivated over decades to make him doubt his decisions and feel guilty for standing up to her. This is insane, David said, running his hands through his hair. She's acting like I've committed some unforgivable sin by asking her to be nice to my wife. That's because in her mind, you have committed an unforgivable sin, I said. You've chosen me over her. You've put your marriage first instead of her feelings. For a woman who's used to controlling every aspect of your life, that's the ultimate betrayal. The next morning brought a new escalation. David's sister Caroline called from Seattle, where she'd been living for the past 5 years after deliberately putting 3,000 miles between herself and Margaret's influence. What the hell did you do to Mother? Caroline demanded without a preamble. She called me at 6 a.m, sobbing about how you've turned against the family and chosen some stranger over your own blood. Emma isn't a stranger, Caroline. She's my wife of 3 years, and she's been treated like garbage by Mother from day one. Oh, come on, David. Mother's always been particular about social situations, but she's not mean. Maybe Emma's just being oversensitive. Why does everyone keep saying that? David's voice rose with frustration. Why is it always Emma's fault? For being hurt by Mother's behavior instead of Mother's fault for behaving hurtfully? Caroline was quiet for a moment. What exactly has Mother done that's so terrible? David spent 20 minutes detailing Margaret's systematic campaign of exclusion and manipulation. As he talked, I could hear Caroline's responses changing from defensive to uncertain to concerned. I had no idea, she said finally. I mean, I knew Mother could be controlling. That's why I moved to Seattle, but I didn't realize she was being that deliberate about undermining Emma. She's been playing a long game, trying to make Emma so miserable that she'd either leave me or I'd get tired of dealing with the constant conflict and end the marriage myself. And now that you've called her out on it, she's having a complete meltdown, Caroline said. David, I love you, and I want you to be happy, but be prepared for this to get worse. Mother doesn't handle losing control well, and she's never lost a battle this important before. That afternoon, Margaret played her nuclear card. She showed up at my office. I was in the middle of a client presentation when my assistant knocked on the conference room door. Emma, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's Margaret Richardson here to see you. She says it's urgent family business. Client, a tech startup CEO named Jake Morrison, looked curious about the interruption. Family emergency? He asked kindly. We can reschedule if you need to deal with it. No, I said quickly, my mind racing. Could you give me 5 minutes? I'll handle this quickly and we can finish up. I stepped out of the conference room to find Margaret in our reception area, looking perfectly composed in an expensive black suit and pearls. She'd dressed for battle, and she'd chosen to bring the fight to my workplace. Margaret, I said, keeping my voice professional despite my racing heart. This is unexpected. Hello, Emma. I was hoping we could have a private conversation about what's happening between David and me. Perhaps we could step outside. I glanced back at the conference room where my client was waiting, then at my assistant who was watching this interaction with obvious curiosity. Margaret had timed this perfectly, knowing I'd be trapped between professional obligations and personal conflict. I'm in the middle of a client meeting, I said. Could we schedule something for later? I'm afraid this can't wait. David has cut off all communication with me, and you're the only one who can help resolve this situation. The implied threat was clear. Make time for me now, or I'll cause a scene in your workplace that could damage your professional reputation. Margaret had done her homework, understanding that my graphic design business depended on client relationships and professional credibility. 5 minutes, I said, leading her to a small conference room we used for private calls. Margaret closed the door behind us and immediately dropped her composed facade. Her eyes were red from crying, her usual perfect makeup slightly smudged, and her hands were shaking slightly as she clutched her purse. Emma, I don't know what I've done to make you hate me so much, but please don't destroy my relationship with my son over it. The reversal was breathtaking. Now I was the aggressor, the one causing pain and destruction. Margaret had rewritten the entire narrative, casting herself as the bewildered victim of my inexplicable hostility. I don't hate you, Margaret, I said, carefully. But I won't continue to accept disrespectful treatment in the name of keeping peace. Disrespectful treatment? Emma, I've been nothing but welcoming to you since the day David brought you home. If I've said or done anything that hurt your feelings, it was certainly unintentional. Was throwing away my lasagna unintentional? Was telling me I'm not equipped to be your son's wife unintentional? Margaret's face crumpled, and for a moment I almost believed her distress was genuine. I never meant those things the way you interpreted them. I was trying to be helpful, to guide you in understanding the expectations that come with being part of our family. By making me feel like I'm not good enough? By trying to help you succeed? Emma, David has a certain position in society, certain responsibilities. I wanted to help you navigate that world, not exclude you from it. It was a masterful reframing, turning her deliberate cruelty into misguided helpfulness. If I hadn't experienced 3 years of her systematic campaign, I might have been swayed by her apparent sincerity. Margaret, even if that were true, the way you've gone about it has been hurtful and destructive. David and I are trying to build a marriage together, and your interference has made that incredibly difficult. I just want my son to be happy, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face now. If I've made mistakes in how I've tried to help, I'm sorry. But please don't punish me by taking David away from me. He's all I have. The emotional manipulation was expert level, designed to make me feel guilty for taking her son and responsible for her pain. But I'd learned to recognize her tactics, and I wasn't falling for them anymore. David isn't being taken away from you, I said firmly. He's setting boundaries because he's a married man now. Those boundaries don't have to mean the end of your relationship with him, but they do mean the end of your attempts to control his life and marriage. Margaret's tears stopped as quickly as they'd started, and I saw a flash of the cold calculation I'd come to know so well. You've really poisoned him against me, haven't you? I've done nothing except ask my husband to stand up for our marriage. If that feels like poison to you, Maybe you should examine why his loyalty to his wife threatens you so much. Margaret stood up abruptly, her mask finally slipping completely. You have no idea what you're dealing with, little girl. I've been part of this community for 40 years. I know everyone who matters in this city, and they all know me. If you think you can turn my son against me without consequences, you're more naive than I thought. The threat was crystal clear now. Margaret wasn't just going to target David's career. She was going to use her entire social network to make our lives in Boston as difficult as possible. Are you threatening me, Margaret? I'm educating you about reality. This city is smaller than you think, and reputation matters more than you understand. I hope for David's sake that you figure out how to make this right before it's too late. She left without another word, leaving me standing in our conference room with my hands shaking and my heart pounding. Margaret Richardson had just declared total war, and she'd made it clear that she was willing to destroy both David's career and my business to win it. When I returned to my client meeting, Jake Morrison took one look at my face and immediately asked if everything was okay. I managed to finish the presentation, but my mind was reeling with the implications of Margaret's visit. That evening, when I told David what had happened, his face went white with rage. She came to your office? She threatened your business? She was very careful not to make any direct threats, but the message was clear. She's going to use her social connections to make life difficult for both of us if we don't back down. David paced our living room like a caged animal. This has gone too far. Way too far. She's crossed every line there is to cross. What are we going to do? David stopped pacing and looked at me with determination I'd never seen before. We're going to call her bluff. And if she wants to wage war using her social connections, then it's time she learned that some battles come with consequences she's not prepared for. I realized that Margaret Richardson had made a crucial miscalculation. In her desperation to reclaim control over her son, she'd pushed him past his breaking point. The respectful son who'd spent 32 years avoiding conflict with his mother was gone, replaced by a man who was finally ready to fight for his marriage and his independence. Margaret wanted a war? She was about to get one. The next morning, David made a phone call that would change everything. But this time, he wasn't calling his mother. Chef Rodriguez? This is David Richardson. I need to hire you for a very special dinner party. I looked up from my coffee, confused. David was standing by our kitchen window, looking out at the street with the kind of focused determination I'd seen when he was preparing for major business presentations. Who's Chef Rodriguez? I asked after he hung up. David turned to me with a smile that was equal parts mischievous and resolute. Remember how Mother always brags about her connections to famous chefs? How does she name-drop Chef Rodriguez from Bella Vista whenever she wants to impress people at dinner parties? Bella Vista was Boston's most exclusive restaurant, booked months in advance and frequented by celebrities and politicians. Chef Rodriguez was a culinary legend, the kind of chef who appeared on cooking shows and had cookbooks on bestseller lists. David, what are you planning? I'm planning to show Mother exactly what it looks like when someone actually respects your cooking and your heritage. Chef Rodriguez is coming here tomorrow night to prepare a meal that celebrates your grandmother's lasagna recipe. I stared at him in shock. You're hiring a world-famous chef to make my grandmother's lasagna? Not just make it, elevate it. I told him about the recipe, about what it means to you, and about how Mother dismissed it as peasant food. He was actually offended on your behalf. Apparently, he has strong feelings about people who disrespect family recipes and cultural heritage. The audacity of it took my breath away. David wasn't just standing up to his mother anymore. He was making a statement that would reverberate through Boston's entire social scene. Margaret had spent decades using her connections to exclusivity and sophistication as weapons. Now David was turning those same weapons against her. Who are we inviting to this dinner? Everyone Mother cares about impressing. Her book club friends, the wives from the country club, some of Dad's business associates. People who've heard her talk about her sophisticated palate and her connections to the culinary world. David, that's brilliant. But what if they don't come? They'll come. I sent the invitations this morning, mentioning that Chef Rodriguez would be preparing an exclusive menu inspired by family traditions and cultural heritage. Half of them have probably never eaten at Bella Vista but pretend they have. They won't be able to resist the chance to actually meet him. Over the next 24 hours, David orchestrated the most elegant revenge I could have imagined. He hired servers from the restaurant, ordered the finest wines, and even arranged for fresh flowers that complemented the Italian theme of the evening. But the centerpiece would be my grandmother's lasagna, prepared by one of America's most celebrated chefs. Chef Rodriguez arrived that afternoon to prep, and I was amazed by his enthusiasm for the project. He was a small, energetic man in his Z50s with calloused hands and the kind of intense focus that comes from decades of perfecting his craft. "Your husband told me about your grandmother's recipe," he said, reviewing the ingredient list I'd written out for him. San Marzano tomatoes, fresh pasta, 3 types of cheese. This is not peasant food. This is cooking with soul, with history. Anyone who calls this peasant food doesn't understand what real cooking is about. He spent hours preparing the sauce, tasting and adjusting, asking me questions about my grandmother's techniques. She roasted the vegetables first? Smart woman. And the ricotta? She made it fresh? Of course she did. Your grandmother was an artist, Mrs. Richardson. Hearing those words from someone of his caliber brought tears to my eyes. This was what Margaret had thrown in the garbage. Not just food, but generations of love and tradition passed down through the women in my family. The guests began arriving at 7 o'clock. Margaret came with Charles, her face carefully composed, but her eyes darting around our dining room with obvious confusion. She dressed for battle in an elegant black dress and her finest jewelry, clearly expecting another confrontation with David and me. Instead, she found herself at the most sophisticated dinner party our home had ever hosted. Chef Rodriguez greeted each guest personally, and the servers moved through our living room offering appetizers and perfectly paired wines. Margaret's book club friends were practically swooning over the opportunity to meet a celebrity chef, and even the country club wives seemed impressed by the level of elegance David had achieved. "I don't understand," Margaret murmured to Charles, loud enough for me to overhear. "What is this about?" David appeared at her elbow with a glass of wine and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's about celebrating family traditions, Mother. About honoring the recipes and heritage that make us who we are." When we sat down to dinner, Chef Rodriguez presented each course with the kind of theatrical flair that made everyone feel like they were dining at a Michelin-starred restaurant. But the main course was the masterpiece, my grandmother's lasagna, elevated to a level of sophistication that somehow honored both its humble origins and its potential for greatness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chef Rodriguez announced, "tonight's main course is inspired by a recipe that has been passed down through 3 generations of strong women. This lasagna represents the kind of cooking that built America. Immigrants, bringing their traditions to a new country and creating something beautiful from simple, honest ingredients." He went on to describe each element of the dish, the hours of slow cooking that had developed the sauce's depth, the handmade pasta that provided the perfect texture, the careful balance of cheeses that created both richness and lightness. He talked about my grandmother's techniques with the kind of reverence usually reserved for classical masters. Margaret's face grew paler with each word. She was watching her social circle listen with rapt attention as a world-renowned chef praised the very recipe she'd dismissed and discarded. The women who usually hung on her every word about culinary sophistication were now learning about real cooking heritage from someone whose opinion actually mattered. "Mrs. Richardson," Chef Rodriguez said, turning to me, "would you tell our guests about your grandmother and this recipe?" I stood up, my heart pounding, and looked around the table at faces that were genuinely interested in what I had to say. For the first time in 3 years, I was the center of attention at a family gathering, but this time it was because people wanted to hear my story, not because I was being humiliated. I told them about my grandmother's tiny kitchen in Kansas, about standing on a step stool to help her layer the ingredients, about the way she'd taught me that cooking was an act of love. I talked about the careful selection of ingredients for Sunday's dinner, about wanting to share something meaningful with David's family. Food is how we connect with each other, I said, looking directly at Margaret. It's how we show love, how we honor our past, and how we welcome people into our lives. When someone puts time and effort into preparing a meal for you, they're offering you a piece of their heart. The silence that followed was profound. I could see several of the women wiping their eyes, moved by the story and the obvious emotion behind it. Margaret sat frozen, realizing that she'd not only thrown away my food, she'd rejected an offering of love in front of witnesses who now understood exactly what that meant. Chef Rodriguez began serving the lasagna, and the first bites were met with genuine exclamations of delight. This wasn't just comfort food. It was comfort food prepared with the skill and presentation of a master chef. Every layer was perfectly balanced, every flavor distinct but harmonious. "This is extraordinary," said Patricia Whitmore, the president of Margaret's Book Club. "Emma, you must give me this recipe. I had no idea you were such a talented cook." "The talent runs in her family," David said proudly. 3 generations of women who understood that the best cooking comes from the heart. Margaret hadn't taken a single bite. She sat staring at her plate while her friends praised the very dish she'd dismissed, complimented the very woman she'd tried to exclude, and celebrated the very traditions she'd deemed unsuitable for the Richardson family. After dinner, as the guests mingled over coffee and dessert, Patricia approached me with genuine warmth. "Emma, I owe you an apology. Margaret always made it sound like you were, well, like you didn't quite fit in with our crowd. But tonight has shown me what an interesting and accomplished person you are. I hope we can get to know each other better." Similar conversations happened throughout the evening. Women who'd barely acknowledged me at previous gatherings were now asking about my work, my family, my interests. They were seeing me as a person rather than just Margaret's disappointing daughter-in-law. Margaret watched it all happening with the expression of someone witnessing her own social execution. Her carefully constructed narrative about me was crumbling in real time, replaced by direct evidence of my worth and David's obvious pride in his wife. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Chef Rodriguez approached Margaret directly. "Mrs. Richardson," he said with professional politeness, "your son told me that you had some concerns about this recipe being appropriate for your family gatherings. I wanted to assure you that dishes like this, made with high-quality ingredients and traditional techniques, represent the very best of American cooking heritage. You should be proud to have this recipe in your family." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. I didn't realize. Food snobbery is unfortunately common among people who don't actually understand cooking, Chef Rodriguez continued, his tone remaining pleasant, but his words cutting deep. "Real chefs recognize quality and heart wherever we find it. Your daughter-in-law comes from a tradition of excellent home cooking. You're very fortunate." After the last guest left, the 3 of us, David, Margaret, and I, stood in our living room surrounded by the evidence of the evening's success. Margaret looked smaller somehow, diminished by the realization of what she'd lost and what she'd revealed about herself. "David," she said quietly, "I think I owe you both an apology." "You think?" David's voice was cold. "Mother, you spent 3 years trying to convince me that my wife wasn't good enough for our family. Tonight, you watched some of the most sophisticated people in Boston celebrate her cooking and her heritage. How does that make you feel?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time, they seemed genuine rather than manipulative. "Ashamed," she whispered. "I feel ashamed." "You should," I said, my voice steady but not cruel. You took something I made with love and threw it away like garbage. You dismissed my family's traditions as beneath your standards. You tried to make me feel unwelcome in my own marriage. I was afraid, Margaret admitted, sinking into one of our chairs. I was afraid of losing David, of becoming irrelevant in his life. You were so different from what I'd imagined for him, and I thought if I could just make you uncomfortable enough. You thought I'd leave, I finished. You thought you could drive me away and have your son back? Margaret nodded miserably. I realize now how wrong I was. Not just wrong, but cruel. You're a lovely person, Emma, and you make David happy in ways I never even noticed because I was too busy trying to find fault with you. It was the admission I'd waited 3 years to hear, but now that it had come, I felt more exhausted than vindicated. Where do we go from here? David asked. Margaret looked up at both of us with something like hope in her eyes. Could we start over? Could you teach me how to make your grandmother's lasagna? I'd like to learn about your family's traditions instead of dismissing them. I looked at David, seeing the question in his eyes. This was my choice to make. We can try, I said finally. But Margaret, this isn't just about cooking. This is about respect, about treating me like a valued member of this family instead of an intruder you're trying to eliminate. I understand, she said, and I promise to do better. You both deserve better than what I've given you. 6 months later, Margaret and I stood side by side in her kitchen, making lasagna together for David's birthday dinner. She'd insisted on learning my grandmother's recipe exactly as it had been passed down, without any of her usual improvements or substitutions. The secret is in the patience, I told her as we layered the ingredients. Each step takes time, but that's what builds the flavor. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Margaret said, carefully spreading the ricotta mixture. I wish I'd had the chance to meet her. She would have liked you, I said, surprising myself by meaning it. She always said that the best thing about cooking with someone is learning their story. Our relationship would never be perfect. Margaret still had moments where her old controlling instincts surfaced, and I still had to remind her of the boundaries we'd established. But something fundamental had changed that night when Chef Rodriguez elevated my grandmother's recipe and forced Margaret to confront her own prejudices. She'd learned that love isn't about control, and I'd learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to build something better on the foundation of hard-won understanding. The lasagna we made together that day was different from my grandmother's version, but it was good in its own way. It was the taste of a family learning to blend their traditions, their expectations, and their love into something that honored everyone at the table. And when David took his first bite and smiled at both of us with genuine happiness, I knew we'd finally found our recipe for peace. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.